I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped onto my porch and saw a large, obnoxious sign staring me down from the waterfront, a bold, red-lettered declaration that read, "No trespassing, private property of Richard B. Tomlinson." I blinked. Surely I was seeing things. This had to be some elaborate joke. But as I walked down my own driveway, the sight of a newly built fence cutting right across my lawn told me otherwise. My heart pounded with a mix of confusion and rage. That was my land, my dock, my waterfront, my property, and yet my neighbor, Richard, the self-appointed king of the neighborhood HOA, a man whose most thrilling life event was reporting people's trash bins being 1 inch out of alignment, had somehow convinced himself that he owned it. I stormed over, disbelief morphing into fury with each step. There he was, standing smugly by the fence, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on his nose as if he had just conquered a new empire. His potbelly strained against a polo shirt 2 sizes too small, and his khaki shorts screamed, "Man who argues over coupons." He gave me the kind of smirk that made me want to launch him into the lake. "Ah, finally," he said, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "I was wondering when you'd notice. Figured you'd be by sooner." "Richard, what the hell is this?" I gestured wildly at the fence, the sign, the absurdity of it all. "This is my land. My dock. Actually, it's mine," he interrupted, lifting a single smug finger like some kind of cartoon villain. "I did some research, and it turns out that this part of the property," he motioned to my dock, my boat, and my perfect lakeside retreat, "was wrongly surveyed when you bought it. It legally belongs to me." My vision blurred with rage. "You have got to be kidding me." "Oh, I wish I were," he said, chuckling like we were sharing a joke. "But I had my lawyer look into it, and according to some very interesting historical property lines, this dock is within my rightful boundary." I could barely process what he was saying before the sheer audacity of it smacked me in the face. My name was on every deed, every document. I had owned this property for years, and now, out of nowhere, this power-hungry suburban overlord was trying to claim a chunk of my land with the enthusiasm of a gold rush prospector. And then, as if he hadn't already thrown enough gasoline on the fire, he waved a dismissive hand toward my deck. "Oh, and by the way, I'll be hosting a small get-together here this weekend," he said. "Just a little neighborhood appreciation barbecue. Nothing big. But I would appreciate it if you respected my property rights and stayed off." I laughed. It wasn't a sane laugh. It was the kind of laugh a person makes when their brain momentarily disconnects from reality because what they are hearing is so impossibly ridiculous that logic ceases to function. "You're joking. You are actually hosting a party. On my deck. On my property that you just decided was yours." "I mean, it's not technically yours anymore," he said, winking like we were old pals sharing a secret. "You really should check your records better. But no hard feelings, right?" The sheer level of smugness radiating off this man was enough to power a small city. My fists clenched at my sides, and for a moment I wondered how long it would take for a jury to declare me innocent due to justifiable rage. But instead, I took a deep breath, forced my hands to unclench, and did the only thing I could. I called my lawyer. That should have been the end of it. Any sane person would have realized their mistake, backed off, maybe apologized for their lapse in judgment. But Richard wasn't sane. He was the kind of man who took a little bit of power and immediately started acting like he was an emperor of a forgotten kingdom. Over the next few days, I discovered just how deep his delusions ran. Not only had he convinced himself he owned my land, but he had filed a legal claim, presenting documents so ancient they looked like they belonged in a museum. He had gone door to door in the neighborhood, telling everyone that he had always owned the land and that I had just been squatting on it all these years. And the final insult? He had actually listed my property for sale. Yes, that's right. I woke up one morning to find a for sale by owner sign placed neatly on the edge of my driveway, with a listing for my dock online, claiming it was a rare lakeside retreat, newly available due to property rights correction. I had never wanted to commit arson before. But at that moment I understood why people burned things to the ground out of sheer frustration. But I wasn't about to let Richard win. No, if he wanted a war, he was about to get one. And I was going to make sure he regretted ever crossing me. I wasn't going to let Richard steal my land without a fight, but this wasn't just about proving my ownership anymore. It was about principle. About making sure that smug, khaki-wearing, HOA weaponizing lunatic understood that there were consequences to his actions. He thought he could bulldoze over me with fake documents and a condescending smirk, but what he didn't realize was that I was prepared to fight fire with fire, and I was a hell of a lot better at setting traps than he was at weaseling his way through loopholes. The first step was simple: make his life as miserable as humanly possible while staying completely within the law. My first move was to take advantage of one thing Richard had always prided himself on: the neighborhood's HOA regulations. He was the self-proclaimed guardian of the community's pristine aesthetic, the kind of man who had once tried to fine a neighbor for having their garden gnome facing the wrong direction. But here's the thing about self-righteous rule enforcers: they often don't follow the very rules they shove down everyone else's throat. So I did what any reasonable, totally not petty homeowner would do: I went on a little research expedition. Turns out, Richard had been in violation of multiple HOA policies for years. His trash cans? Left out on non-pickup days. His holiday decorations? Well past their removal deadline. His backyard? Home to an unauthorized chicken coop, which was a particularly hilarious revelation given that he had once tried to have a neighbor fined for putting up a birdhouse. And the piece de resistance? His beloved, ridiculously oversized pink flamingo lawn ornaments, ones that he had insisted added character to his yard, were, according to the HOA bylaws, an unauthorized lawn display exceeding community decor standards. I compiled my findings, printed out every single violation, and submitted an anonymous complaint to the HOA board. The very next week, Richard received a fine so large he actually had the audacity to show up at my doorstep and complain about it, as if I were somehow responsible for his inability to follow the very rules he enforced on others. "This is ridiculous," he grumbled, waving the citation letter in my face. "You know how corrupt the HOA is. They're just looking for ways to extort money out of hard-working homeowners like me." I stared at him, baffled by the sheer lack of self-awareness. "You tried to fine a guy last year because his mailbox was too whimsical. That was different," he snapped, nose flaring. "Mailboxes set the tone for the entire street." I didn't bother arguing. I just smiled, shrugged, and let him stew in his own misery. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan required a little creativity. Richard was greedy. He had dollar signs in his eyes the moment he thought he could sell my land, so I decided to use that to my advantage. With the help of a few tech-savvy friends, I created a fake buyer, an investor supposedly looking to purchase waterfront property at an exorbitantly high price. I knew Richard wouldn't be able to resist. It wasn't long before I caught wind that he had actually reached out to the buyer himself, gloating about how he had acquired the land and was looking to sell it to the highest bidder. He even had the nerve to schedule a showing of my own damn property, to pitch it as a prime investment opportunity. The day of the showing, I made sure to be nearby, casually observing as Richard strutted around like a used car salesman, gesturing wildly at the dock, the view, and even my deck furniture as if it were part of the deal. The buyer, a friend of mine posing as a rich, eccentric investor, played along beautifully, nodding and murmuring in fake interest as Richard rattled off a bunch of nonsense about the property's historical significance and exclusive access rights. Then, just as he was getting to the good part about how he had legally reclaimed the land, the real surprise arrived: the investigator I had hired, along with a legal consultant. The moment Richard saw them, his smug expression faltered. It was a beautiful sight. "Mr. Tomlinson," the investigator began, flipping open a folder, We've received reports that you've been attempting to sell property that you do not legally own. Do you have any documentation to support your claims of ownership?" Richard sputtered, looking from the investigator to the fake buyer to me, slowly realizing he had been played. Well, you see, there was an old property deed from. That deed has already been reviewed," the legal consultant cut in smoothly. "It is invalid and has no legal bearing. Additionally, attempting to sell property that does not belong to you is a criminal offense." Richard's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, jaw clenching like he was trying to physically restrain himself from having a full-blown tantrum. "This is harassment," he finally spat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I'll have my lawyer handle this." "Great," I said, crossing my arms. "You do that. But just so you know, I've also filed a formal lawsuit for damages and legal fees. So maybe tell your lawyer to prepare for that too?" Richard turned on his heel and stomped off, muttering curses under his breath as the investigator continued jotting down notes. The moment he was out of earshot, my friend, the buyer, burst out laughing. "Damn," he said, shaking his head. "You really went all out?" "Oh, I'm not done yet," I replied, watching Richard retreat to his house in a huff. "Not even close." Richard thought he could walk away from this unscathed, that somehow he could weasel his way out of the mess he created with the same smug confidence he used to police other people's lawn decorations. But reality was beginning to close in on him like a slow, suffocating trap, and I was about to make sure it snapped shut with no room for escape. Word had already spread around the neighborhood about his fraudulent land grab, and the gossip spread faster than a wildfire in a dry season. It didn't take long for the HOA board to get involved, and the same people who once treated him as their beloved rule enforcer were now turning on him, furious that he had brought unwanted legal attention to the community. I heard whispers of emergency meetings, concerned discussions about how Richard's actions could result in a liability issue for the entire neighborhood. And then, the HOA dropped the first official blow, revoking his self-appointed status as the community's enforcer. He had spent years throwing fines at people for minor infractions, yet now, when he needed their support the most, they threw him under the bus without hesitation. That should have been enough to humble him, but Richard was the kind of man who would rather die on a hill made of his own bad decisions than admit he was wrong. Instead of backing down, he doubled down, insisting to anyone who would listen that I had somehow manipulated the legal system to work in my favor, that I had bribed officials, that I was running some kind of grand conspiracy against him. The final breaking point came when the lawsuit officially reached his doorstep. I had been waiting for this moment, and I could see the exact second his arrogance finally cracked when he found the neatly delivered legal notice sitting on his front porch. He picked it up, flipping through the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he skimmed the content. He wasn't just being sued for trying to claim my land. He was being sued for damages, fraudulent misrepresentation, legal fees, and emotional distress. The amount he owed wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was enough to ensure he would never attempt this kind of stunt again. That night, I heard the sound of something shattering from his house, followed by a long, muffled string of curses. It was music to my ears. But the real satisfaction came when his house was suddenly swarmed by a news crew. Apparently, someone, I won't say who, but let's just say I have excellent connections, had tipped off the local media about the entire ordeal. Within a day, the story had made its way onto the evening news, complete with footage of Richard's ridiculous fake, no trespassing signs and his laughable attempt at fencing off my property. The anchor, barely able to contain their amusement, detailed the whole debacle, painting Richard as a delusional, power-hungry neighbor who had finally gotten what he deserved. The news report even included interviews with some of our neighbors, who were more than happy to share their grievances about Richard's years of petty tyranny. "Honestly, it's karma," one woman said, shaking her head. "He once reported my house for having curtains that clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic, And now he's out here committing land fraud? Unbelievable! The public humiliation was unbearable for him. For a man who thrived on control, on keeping up the appearance of being the neighborhood's moral authority, being exposed on live television as a fraud was the equivalent of social exile. The very next day, his property, once pristine and obsessively maintained, suddenly looked abandoned. No more morning walks where he would scrutinize other people's lawns. No more lectures about the importance of a properly aligned mailbox. No more smug interactions where he would puff out his chest like he was the king of the block. He had gone into full retreat mode, barely stepping outside except for the occasional, furious phone call I could hear through my open windows. And then, the inevitable happened: Richard, drowning in legal fees, HOA fines, and the social fallout of his spectacular failure, was forced to put his house up for sale. The very property where he had schemed, plotted, and thrown his ridiculous neighborhood barbecues was now up for grabs. The irony was almost too delicious to handle. He had tried to steal my land, and now he was the one being forced to leave. I should have been satisfied with just that, with knowing that justice had been served and that he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But I wanted to go one step further. The cherry on top of this entire situation was when I, through a series of anonymous purchases and a little bit of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, managed to buy his house at a foreclosure auction for an absurdly low price. The day the sale was finalized, I made sure Richard saw me standing on the sidewalk, paperwork in hand, watching as he packed up his belongings in a frantic, defeated scramble. He saw me, paused, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have anything to say. No insults, no smug remarks, nothing. Just silence. I held his gaze for a few seconds before giving him a small, polite wave, the kind of wave a person gives when they're seeing off an old friend. And then, just because I couldn't help myself, I pulled out a brand new sign, one I had custom-made just for him. I planted it right in the front yard where he used to stand and lecture people about community rules. It read, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Now under new ownership." The look on his face was priceless. And just like that, Richard was gone, dragging his tail between his legs as he drove off, never to terrorize the neighborhood again. I had won. Not just the legal battle, not just the property dispute. I had won in every possible way. And as I stood there on my newly reclaimed land, watching the peaceful ripples on the water, I finally felt it. Peace. Real, uninterrupted peace. With Richard gone and my land officially reclaimed, I should have been content to just move on, enjoy my peaceful waterfront property, and let the whole ridiculous saga fade into the past. But the thing about people like Richard is that they leave behind a certain kind of energy, a lingering presence of their entitled stupidity that just begs for a final exorcism. I wasn't about to let the memory of his nonsense linger like a bad smell, so I decided to make a few improvements. The first order of business was to ensure that my property was permanently protected from any future delusional land grab attempts. I had my lawyer draft an ironclad legal declaration that not only reaffirmed my ownership but also made it impossible for anyone to ever claim the land under any outdated, fraudulent, or loophole-ridden arguments again. I filed it, stamped it, and practically framed it on my wall like a trophy. But that was just the practical step. The real fun came in turning Richard's former territory into something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The house he once ruled over like a tyrannical HOA overlord now belonged to me, and I had no intention of selling it. Instead, I repurposed it in a way that would ensure he could never return, not even for a visit. After careful consideration, I decided that the best possible use for the property would be to turn it into a pet rescue center, specifically for the loudest, most chaotic animals I could find. The kind of animals that would make the neighborhood vibrate with joyful, high-energy noise at all hours of the day. Barking dogs, squawking parrots, the occasional rescued goat. It was a beautiful vision, a complete transformation of the sterile, regulation-obsessed nightmare Richard had cultivated. I made sure to install a brand new, brightly colored sign on the front lawn that read, "Happy Tales Animal Sanctuary, a forever home for rescued pets." The neighborhood, which had been terrorized by Richard's enforcement of the quietest, most boring possible version of suburbia, absolutely loved it. The HOA, which had once been Richard's personal weapon, was now powerless to do anything about it, because technically, everything about the sanctuary was within legal guidelines. The community even rallied around it, donating supplies and volunteering to help set it up. It became a local landmark, a symbol of what happens when an entitled person's iron grip on control is finally broken. But the real masterpiece, the real stroke of poetic justice, came when I learned that Richard had been forced to move into a rental property across town, a much smaller, much less prestigious home that was, coincidentally, right next to a public park. And not just any park, but the most lively, bustling, family-friendly one in the city. It was the kind of place where children screamed joyfully from morning until night, where birthday parties and community events filled the weekends with endless noise and laughter, where dogs ran free in an off-leash area right next to his backyard fence. Richard, the man who had spent years patrolling the neighborhood for nuisances like slightly overgrown grass or music played 1 decibel too loud, was now stuck in the middle of the very chaos he had spent his life trying to crush. The irony was almost too perfect. From time to time, I'd hear updates about him through the neighborhood grapevine. Apparently, he had tried to start enforcing unwritten rules in his new community, but unlike our old neighborhood, this one had no patience for his nonsense. His complaints about excessive noise were ignored, his attempts to push for stricter community regulations were laughed off, and he had even gotten into a public shouting match with a group of teenagers over their choice of music at the park. The best part? Someone had recorded it and posted it online, where it quickly became a minor viral sensation. The video, titled "Grumpy Old Man vs. Park Kids, Guess Who Wins?" was an instant hit. Watching Richard's face turn red with rage as a group of kids casually drowned him out with their portable speaker was pure gold. But the real cherry on top came a few months later, when he made one last, desperate attempt to regain some sense of power by running for HOA president in his new neighborhood. He must have thought that if he could climb back to his old position of authority, he could restore some of his lost dignity. What he didn't anticipate was that his reputation had followed him. The moment his name appeared on the ballot, someone in the community posted a detailed recounting of his land theft scandal, complete with links to the news segment that had aired about him. His campaign was dead before it even started. When the votes were tallied, he had received exactly 1 vote, his own. As for me, life had never been better. My property was secure, my peace was restored, and I now had a thriving animal sanctuary that brought genuine joy to the community. Every morning, I would step out onto my deck with a cup of coffee, taking in the beautiful, uninterrupted view of the lake, knowing that it was mine, indisputably, forever. No more fences, no more fake for-sale signs, no more absurd legal battles. Just peace. Real, uninterrupted peace. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of satisfaction knowing that somewhere, out there, Richard was still fuming, still convinced that the world had wronged him, still shaking his fists at the heavens, powerless to do anything about it. It was a beautiful thing,